Let's talk a little bit about striking and cutting. So one of the issues that I try and get across to a lot of my students is about where to hit with the blade in terms of the centre of percussion. So we've spoken a lot in previous videos about obviously edge alignment. If you want to cut effectively, you've got to make sure the edge is aligned, but equally you've got to make sure you're hitting with the correct portion of the blade. Generally speaking, with most of the types of blade that we're talking about, they don't cut particularly well at the tip. Whereas they do cut very well, or most effectively, in this portion of the blade, which is known as the centre of percussion. Centre of percussion, you can measure quite easily where it is. You can do it mathematically, but that's the long way round. The easiest way to do is just basically you tap something until you feel that it gets strong, and usually it's about there. Obviously, if it's sharp, don't use your hand, use a piece of wood or something else. But generally speaking, you'll feel that the most force is transmitted to the target, to the thing you're hitting, usually about 3/4 or 2/3 of the way up the blade. And this is the most effective portion to cut with, but there's another reason for that as well. If you look at most blade designs, they are usually at their flattest or thinnest in this portion of the blade for that reason. Very often with tapered blades, they get pointy at the tip, and the edge geometry is such that you usually don't have a very acute edge. Essentially the angles of the edge meet more like that rather than like that. At this portion of the blade around here, the edges meet more with a smaller angle, more acute angle, and as we get closer and closer to the tip, because you've still got to have a certain amount of thickness for the stiffness for thrusting, essentially the angle gets broader and broader, and this means inherently that it's going to cut even worse at the tip, as well as the fact that physically we know that the most force is transmitted down here, not up here, despite the fact that yes, the tip is moving fastest, but the geometry and the shape of the blade just mean that it doesn't cut very well at the tip. There are some exceptions. If we look at things like falchions, like my Cogna's falchion, which is very broad at the tip, clearly that's going to cut very well at the tip because it has a concentration of mass at the tip. This doesn't. In actual fact, you know, the tapering types of blades get less mass the further you go towards the tip. And equally, if we look at something like a katana or even certain types of sabre, for example the 1796 light cavalry sabre has a broad hatchet pointed tip, and these sort of hatchet tips are generally speaking not very good for thrusting, but they are therefore able to cut better towards the tip. Now let's actually look at some physical stuff here. So if we're striking a target, generally speaking, we want to make sure that when we make impact with it, we're hitting it at an oblique angle. There are a couple of reasons for this. Number one, if we extend out and hit like this, we can reach a bit further, and potentially the tip might be travelling a bit faster if we flick the tip of the blade out. Okay, and this is done in a Shuttle-How type technique. It can be used, it does have a use. But generally speaking, it's not the most effective cut, because if you think about it, what we're doing is we're hitting completely perpendicular at 90 degrees to the target. So we're hitting like that, and that's never going to cut particularly well for a number of reasons. It also has a nasty tendency, especially with one-handed swords doing this, of straining the wrist, or putting more stress on the wrist than is really necessary. And when you hit something and it suddenly stops, if the blade's in line with the forearm, that energy is going to terminate in the elbow, and I myself actually have injured my elbow many years ago doing exactly that with the long sword as it happens, rather than the one-handed sword. So for another reason why hitting at a slight angle cuts better is because it means you're meeting the target at an angle like that, which means that the gradient that the material that you're cutting into meets, it means essentially you're reducing the angle at the edge. Okay, so you're moving it from, say it's a 40 degree angle here, if you move that to 45 degrees, it's now a 20 degree angle going up. So actually it's like you're making the blade finer, okay, or thinner. Okay, so that's the second reason. Next reason is, as soon as you impact something, bum, there is a consequent force, okay? And if I hit completely perpendicular to the target, my blade completely stops, as you'll see. Okay, you can see the blade completely stops. If I were to cut into the target, that would mean that it would enter the target and just stop and get stuck. Now in reality, I know that from doing these types of cuts on resistive materials, usually it doesn't even cut. Okay, but even if it does enter the material, it stops moving. That's no good, really, in most combat situations. You want the blade to be free and to continue moving. When I hit on the slant, it will naturally draw through and past the target, for example like this. Okay, so it passes across and through the target. This has the added benefit that, of course, it means it has a slicing action. So not only are you hitting at an oblique angle, but now the blade draws through and slices on the way out. Now, to cut to the chase, the point I really want to make is that in most sparring that we do, very often we're essentially playing tag. We're aiming to hit the opponent. We're not aiming to cut, because of course we're using blunt weapons or sticks or simulators of some kind, in this case a blunt sword, and so it is going to stop on the target regardless of what type of cut we do. And equally, we want to try and get any edge or advantage we can, so we hit them from as far away as possible, so we hit with the tip, okay, or lots of people do. And we should really be steering away from this. Not to say that it's always incorrect. As I've mentioned, a Scheitelhau type technique, and there are various other techniques. We see it in some sabre treatises as well, where specifically they're trying to hit with the tip from as far away as possible. Bam, okay, from here. That's fine, okay, that's fine for specific things, but what we don't want to do is we don't want to do it all the time. We want the majority of the cuts to be proper conventional cuts that hit at an angle and slice through. Okay, we want them to draw across and through the target, and at the point of impact, the general rule is if we're cutting downwards, the hand is lower than the point of impact. If we're cutting upwards, the hand is higher than the point of impact. Okay, so that it's always an angle. You're always striking so the hand is lower or the hand is higher. Okay, and this is something that I see increasingly as HEMA evolves with a tournament mindset in some places, in some clubs, that inevitably, this is an example, one example, there are other examples I could give, of where sometimes the art or the martial art adapts to the sport. And that's something that I personally don't want to see. I want to see it stay true to the martial arts. So we should still be thinking about cutting, okay, and cutting through a target, and the mechanics of cutting properly. It's one of the reasons why test cutting or cutting for fun, backyard cutting, is a great thing to do, because it reminds you what is actually required to cut, rather than playing tag. What we're not doing is going, ooh, tap, okay? What does that signify? If I take it to the ultimate evolution of that, we get to essentially flick cuts as seen in sports sabre fencing, modern Olympic sports sabre fencing. Flick. What does that represent? Nothing, actually. A tap. And if both people hit each other and one person has done this and the other person has done that, it's fairly clear which person's going to come off worse. That's not to say that necessarily you should be giving all blows like you're trying to, you know, I don't know, chop through 50 tatami mats. Okay, there's no need to do this type of thing. But the cuts should be given with the correct form and structure and passing through the target, at least in theory. So there we go, something to think about. Feel free to post comments underneath, and click a like on the video, and please subscribe if you're not already. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.